Hi everyone, welcome into an episode of Matt Sports Talk, and I apologize for the low lighting here in my bedroom. Of course, it's a little cloudy outside, so that's why it looks a little dark in here. But in this video, I wanted to talk about the latest NAIA Top 25 poll rating in terms of the Crossroads League schools. Let me adjust my camera here real quick just to make sure that it doesn't totally tip over. Make sure that the headroom's good. There we go. That's a lot better. So now in terms of this list, it's kind of interesting to say the least, and that's why I wanted to take a little bit and talk about that. Now, typically I don't record these videos talking about the latest top 25, NAIA top 25 poll, but I definitely wanted to do that today because there is a lot here to talk about. And definitely, it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And some of these teams in the Crossroads League, in terms of where they were moved up or moved down to, some of them I just really don't understand. So we're going to talk about that in this video. And before we do, for those of you that are brand new to my channel, please subscribe so you're first notified whenever I upload new episodes. And I truly appreciate any feedback that you provide me, and please subscribe to the channel, as my goal is to hit 500 subscribers by the very end of this year at the December 31st, 2026. So again, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you're first notified. And I will be, as promised, I'll be with you tomorrow going over recapping all of the Crossroads League games for the men and the women tonight. We have some very, very exciting matchups tonight, highlighted on the men's side by number 1 Grace and now number 3 Bethel. And then on the women's side, we have the game highlighted tonight is number 6 St. Francis hosting Receiving Votes Huntington. So, and not just that, but on the women's side, number 21 Spring Arbor hosting Receiving Votes Taylor. So again, those should be some really exciting games here coming up tonight, and make sure that you stay tuned for those recap videos coming your way tomorrow when we will be going over all of that. So looking at the Crossroads League teams in the latest top 25 poll, last time Marion was ranked 5th, St. Francis was 7th, and then we had Spring Arbor not rated in the last poll, and we also had Huntington previously 20th, and we had Taylor previously receiving votes, and we had Indiana Wesleyan previously receiving votes. So now we're going to go top to bottom, and we're going to go over all of these teams. Now, for Marion, they received 1 first place vote in the last poll, and now, of course, it does go off of points, and they actually were 2 points ahead of Freed-Hardman out of Tennessee, which just beat number 10 Cumberland's, by the way, on Saturday. So looking at Marion, now, Marion's interesting for a couple of reasons, because number 1, while they beat Receiving Votes Taylor by 15 at Taylor back on January 3rd, and then, of course, Marion blew out Grace at home last Wednesday by 50, and then, of course, Marion after that suffered their very first loss of the year by 10, which was at home to St. Francis. Now, unless I'm missing something or really don't understand, all of the particulars. Now, of course, I look at the RPI, I look at the Massey rating. Now, the ARC numbers are not going to be out until Tuesday, which again, I'll be recording videos at that time going over all of that, as well as the updated RPI numbers, which will be coming out on Monday. But in terms of the Massey rating, you had Marion, I believe still ahead of St. Francis in the last Massey rating, and in the RPI number, Marion was ahead of St. Francis in that category. So, to me, I know that they lost to then number 7, which was the very first loss of the year, but that loss was by 10 points. To me, it's kind of, I could understand it a little bit better if Marion had only lost that game to St. Francis on Saturday by, 3 to 6 points. Like, if it was 3 to 6 points, I would have been like, I don't have a problem with Marion moving up 1 spot if it had been, 3 to 6 points. But losing by 10, now yes, Marion was held to under 30% shooting from the floor and like 15% shooting from three, which that's going to happen. Teams are going to have bad games. Even the best of the best teams do in the NCAA. But like I just really don't understand per se why Marion was moved up. Now, I mean, yeah, I guess it was to number 7, but I don't really understand why they moved up one spot, considering they lost by 10, and they were held, by the way, 35 points below their season average, and yet they still moved up one spot. Like, I just really don't. But then again, on the same token, they held St. Francis to, like 30 points below their season average, so I guess it kind of, washes itself out, so to speak. But this was one that I just really did not understand in terms of why Marion was moved up one spot. And then you look at St. Francis, they moved up one spot to 6th. Now, for St. Francis, over the conference break, they did, of course, pick up that big win over Rochester Christian at home, which Rochester Christian upset Indiana Tech, by the way, last month. And then, of course, you look at St. Francis. Now, for them, well, I guess I could see why they moved up one spot despite, and not just that, but, upsetting Marion by 10, which I definitely agree with moving them up because of that. But then at the same token, you also have at St. Francis, they beat a really, really strong Taylor Trojan team at home, beat them by 18, by the way, 62-44 last Wednesday. So I guess, I'm not really surprised that of St. Francis moving up one spot because of that upset win over Marion, but also because of beating Taylor by 18, which was also at home. So, I guess St. Francis really is not that big of a shock to me as opposed to Marion. And then looking further down the list, now we get down to Spring Arbor, and this is a team, under head coach John Williams. They're having a phenomenal season, and of course Haven Chapman, great player on defense. And you also have, Megan Zeitz, who's just phenomenal down low, and they're just a great team all the way around, and they're forcing their opponents into 25 turnovers per game, so they're definitely playing very, very aggressively. And now in terms of the last poll, I really did not understand why they were not rated whatsoever in the last poll. Now, since then, they beat a really, really strong Coastal Georgia team by 17. They lost only by, I believe, 7 to number 8 Rio Grande, so that's a really, really good loss. And then, of course, for Spring Arbor, after that, they upset receiving votes Indiana Wesleyan by 9 2 weeks ago, and then they beat a very strong Bethel Lady Pilot team only by 5, which was at home, by the way, on Saturday. So this is a really, really good Spring Arbor team. And now of course I had said, after their win over Bethel Saturday, I'm like, they need to be ranked at least 20 of 21st, somewhere in there, because they definitely are a top 20 team, and no question about that. And this is a very well-deserving ranking for them. And if they keep, beating some of these really, really good teams, I think they're just going to keep moving right up, honestly. Now, do I see them getting as high as Marion and St. Francis by the end of the season? Probably not. Now, do I see them, potentially getting around that, number 10 to 13 spot by the end of the year? Absolutely, especially if they keep beating these really, really good teams. So this is by far a very, very good team to watch in the Crossroads League. And of course, for them, they're now 15-2. Their only losses coming to number 4 Marion and now number 8 Rio Grande. So 2 really, really good losses for Spring Arbor. So I definitely agree with the committee's decision and putting them inside the top 20. And then getting down into the receiving votes category. Now we start with Huntington. Now, Huntington, they were ranked 20th previously, and now they did have a bad upset loss at Bethel last Wednesday night. Now, they did beat Taylor at home, remaining perfect on their home floor, I might add, this past Saturday. Now, that was only a 3-point margin in terms of that game. Now, they were up by 1 point, at least 20 points on Taylor. Now, had they beaten Taylor by 20 points, then I think Huntington stays inside the top 25. Now, because of them nearly blowing a 20-point lead, I definitely see why they fell out of the top 25, and most definitely because of their upset loss at Bethel. Now, had they beaten Bethel and had they beaten Taylor by 15-20, like what they were up at one point by, then I think Huntington probably would have only fallen down to around that 22-23 spot in the standings. But obviously, losses are going to happen in terms of the Crossroads League, so I definitely agree with the committee's decision having them the third team outside the top 25 with the updated poll. I definitely agree with that as well. And now we get down to Taylor. And now this is another, of course, Cassie Wiseman, their head coach. She's done a phenomenal job this year. They're led by freshman Casey Werfel, who's having a phenomenal season, as well as Selena Blount. Of course, they also have Quinn Kelly, Maddie Allen, Marissa Trout, Emma Anselet, have all really stepped up to lead this Trojan team. Now, this is a Trojan team that they started off 14-0. This again, where the committee has them in the receiving votes category still in the middle of the pack in that category, I disagree with. Now, and here's the reason why. They upset now number 24 Indiana Tech by 4 points at home the day before New Year's Eve. Now, since then, Taylor has lost to number 4 Marion, number 6 St. Francis, and receiving votes Huntington. Now, for Taylor, a 14-point loss to number 4 Marion, that's a great loss. Now, really, what would have helped Taylor, and at least in that game, would probably have been, if they would have kept that game, like 5 to 6 points, that would have been, a really, really good loss. Losing by 15, now while that's still a good loss for Taylor, it definitely did not help them in terms of their ranking being receiving votes, and especially because last Wednesday night against St. Francis, they were held to just 25% shooting from the floor. They lost by 18, 62-44 to St. Francis, I might add. And Taylor in that game, they were held roughly about 40 points below their season average. Now, had they, kept that game, about probably 4 to 7 points, similar to that whole Marion game 2 weeks ago, had Taylor done that against St. Francis, keeping it pretty respectable, about 4 to 7 points, then yeah, I think they move up a few spots in the receiving votes category, especially because of their upset win, 4-point win at home against Indiana Tech. But that is just, now, I think, though, despite them upsetting Indiana Tech, I think what hurt Taylor and them not moving up was because of them losing by roughly 15 points to both Taylor and then losing by just about 20 points to St. Francis. Now, those were really good losses, but obviously you would have loved to have seen them be a little bit closer than that in terms of those games. And then, of course, losing by 3 to Huntington, I think that's also saved them from dropping way further down. Now, had they lost to the Huntington by, 15, 20 points, then I think Taylor would have probably fallen down a few more spots in the receiving votes category. But the way they were able to come back in that game, even though they fell short only by 3 points, I think that was a pretty good loss for Taylor, especially because of how good Huntington's been at home this year. So that is a good loss for sure. And then the last team that we are going to talk about in this video is Indiana Wesleyan. Now, this is a team that obviously they're struggling this year, mightily struggling. They at one point they were ranked 10th in preseason, and believe it or not, it is as hard to believe as what it is. They have fallen completely outside of the ranking. They are an unranked team. Really, for the first time, more than likely, in all of head coach Ethan Whaley's tenure. Now, for Indiana Wesleyan, of course, I mentioned a lot in my videos, they've had a lot of key injuries. Of course, they lost Bria Garber this year due to a knee injury. Of course, they also, they for at least a little bit, they did not have Sydney Gooden or Chloe Graham healthy. So that obviously put a little bit of a dent in their roster. But this is a Lady Wildcat team that, while they have dealt with injuries this year, they're currently sitting 9-8, 3-4 in the conference. Now, of course, since the last poll, they lost to now number 21 Spring Arbor by 9. That's a really good loss, considering that the Wildcats trailed by as much as 21 points in that game in the third quarter and ultimately fell short. So a really good loss there. They beat Mount Vernon by 40 on the road. That game, yeah, while it's a big win, it doesn't really matter because, Mount Vernon's the second worst team in the conference. So, that obviously doesn't really help the Wildcats, so to speak. But then giving up 90 points to Grace at home on Saturday, the first time the Wildcats have had back-to-back home losses in 9 years. And not just that. Now, obviously, Emma Sperry for Grace, she got red hot, 34 points. And sometimes a player just gets that red hot and there's nothing you can do about it. But for the Wildcats, they gave up 30 more points more than their season average in terms of their opponents. On the year going into that game, they were only giving up 60 points to their opponents while scoring 70. And now, while the Wildcats did score 80, actually back-to-back 80-point games, 84 points in Mount Vernon last Wednesday night, 80 points at home Saturday. While that number is really, really good, scoring 80-plus points back-to-back games, of course, what hurt them was giving up 30 points more than their season average. And again, to me, this was no surprise. Them falling completely out of the rankings, even of receiving votes. Really no surprise at all there. Now, of course, one thing that can get them back into the receiving votes category is picking up some really good wins. If they can somehow upset Marion tonight, that would really, really help them. And then once you get closer to the end of the month, of course, really for them, they're going to have to beat Bethel and Goshen the next 2 games, and then try to, ideally, the next 4 games after that, you have Taylor at home, St. Francis on the road, Huntington at home, and number 21, Spring Arbor on the road. So really what would help the Wildcats is if they could pick up all 4 of those games, in the next poll, before the next poll comes out, and then the poll after, actually the next poll comes out the day, at least the morning of the Holm-Taylor game. The next poll after that doesn't come out until Wednesday morning, February 11th. So if the Wildcats can pick up those 4 games against Taylor, St. Francis, Huntington, and Spring Arbor, they have a really, really good chance of getting back up toward the middle of the pack in the receiving votes category. And then if they're able to beat the last 3 games of the regular season, able to beat Grace and then at least Bethel, maybe Marion at home, that would also help them. Then they could conceivably get up towards the very top of the receiving votes category. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how all that plays out. But I definitely understand why they are no longer a ranked team, especially because of their inconsistency this year. And then, of course, having that really bad home loss to Grace on Saturday. Now, can the Wildcats turn it around? Absolutely. But it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out, that's for sure. And there's still time for them to turn it around because the second half of conference play does not start until next Saturday, January 24th. So they at least need to finish the first half of conference play strong, and then, of course, get a week's worth of rest and get prepared to start the second half of conference, which is going to be the most crucial stretch of the season by far. Now, can the Lady Wildcats, can they achieve what Huntington achieved last year? Being 6-1 in the month of February, the only loss for Huntington last year coming to Marion. Can the Wildcats achieve that this year? Absolutely. I fully believe that they can. And fun fact, their very first opponent in the month of February is Huntington. So that's kind of interesting, right? And so, it's definitely going to be a lot of fun to see how all of it plays out. And of course, I mentioned before, the Crossroads League's just so competitive this year, and the competition level is just at an all-time high. That's for sure. Anybody can beat anybody. So it is going to be very, very exciting to see how all of it plays out. So with that said, that recaps today, or that does it for this video in terms of talking about the updated top 25 polls with teams in the Crossroads League, giving you my thoughts on that. And if you did enjoy this video or find it very helpful and informative to you, please either like, comment, or subscribe. Any one of those options helps me out greatly. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I will be back with you tomorrow recapping all of the games from tonight. And we have a very, very exciting slate of games coming up tonight, and I'm very excited to be back with you tomorrow recapping all of those. So I will see you then, and have a great rest of your day. God bless.